broadcasting from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and airing on WCPT 820, Chicago's progressive talk, where facts matter. Welcome to the Gaily Show, the only daily LGBTQ progressive radio news and talk show in America. I am your host, John Parker. Today is our weekly Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode, where we sit down with a guest or two for the majority of the episode to help us think more clearly and more queerly about the major issues of the day facing the LGBTQ and allied community. After that, I continue my Queer and the Cosmos essay series. Coming up after us, get ready for the best in progressive news and analysis with the Matt McNeil Show on AM 950 KTNF and Choose Views with Richard Chu on WCPT 820. Today, we're talking about LGBTQ grant making in the U.S. So last week, we got to talk to Neil Osby, who is the founder of the Visibility Impact Fund, which is a Minnesota-based organization focused on funding bisexual plus communities, and one that gives all their donors a vote on which applications to fund each cycle. Very democratic. We love it. Check out that episode everywhere you get your podcast. Today, we're going to take a big view, zooming out and looking at the entire landscape of LGBTQ grant giving in the United States. Joining me is April Bethea, Director of External Affairs at the Funders for LGBTQ Issues, along with Sammy Luffy, who is the Director of Research. I just realized to both of you that I should have checked in on name pronunciations before we got going here. April, did I pronounce that correctly?
I was impressed, yeah.
All right, perfect. And Sammy?
Unfortunately, no, John. It is Luffy like Goofy. I really apologize. Or if there's any One Piece fans, Monkey D. Luffy, the anime character. You know, that's how I try to help people remember. But no worries, it's a very common mistake.
Okay, well, apologies for that. Should have done that beforehand. Bad host, John. But the Funders for LGBTQ Issues, where April and Sammy lead us and work for, they educate and organize funders and support power building to create an abundance of resources for the justice and liberation of all queer communities. They are a network of more than 100 foundations, corporations, and funding institutions that collectively award more than $1 billion annually, including approximately $200 million specifically devoted to LGBTQ issues. April and Sammy, I'm so glad that you can join us here today because Funders for LGBTQ Issues conducts research, training, and support, as well as convenes grant makers for collective actions. I didn't realize, so I did some digging. For over 20 years, you all have been tracking and issuing an annual report on LGBTQ grant making by U.S. foundations. So the report that we're talking about today is an annual report you've been doing since, I think, like 2003, 2004. Before we get into this particular report, can you tell me more about the series that you've been doing for the past 20 years and its goals? April, do we want to start with you?
Sure. So for 20 years, Funders for LGBTQ Issues has been reporting on the scale and scope of domestic grant making by US-based foundations to LGBTQ communities. Our work, we at Funders, we've been around for 40 years, right? And so we've really been working to shift the needle of LGBTQ philanthropy. And 20 years ago, we came up with this research project. I think with any sector, philanthropy is like any sector, where you have a lot of people who are well-intentioned, but they don't have the resources to make the change that they want to make, right? And so by providing research, our aim is to work with program officers and other folks who are really working to push that needle to move more resources to LGBTQ communities. So this report really looks at the gaps and opportunities. We've informed our own programming at Funders based on the gaps that we see. So we've seen gaps to the US South, we've seen gaps for trans communities, and we really worked as an organization to think through what is the change that we can make in our line of work, in our sector, to really push for more money going to the movements for where we need them the most. And I'll give it to Sammy, my data nerd friend.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, April, for that background. As April said, this report is really the foundation of our organization's contributions to LGBTQ philanthropy and to the sector more broadly, because we recognize that the data, the grants that we are analyzing to create this report every year are also intersectional. And so we categorize each grant by specific populations that those activities may support, such as specific racial or ethnic groups or specific age groups,
Mhm.
as well as for unique strategies or issues or other kinds of programming, like health and well-being, for example, to really try to understand where the funding is going across LGBTQ philanthropy and where those gaps are, as April mentioned. It is important to note that this report is the latest report is looking at grants that were awarded in calendar year 2023. And we have to do that in order to allow foundations to close their books on their whatever annual cycle they use, as well as then to submit the data to us. And then my colleague Alyssa Lother and I do go through a very rigorous process of reviewing the grants for inclusion or exclusion and developing the final data set, then putting the report itself together. So it is a longer term project. We're doing it almost year round, and in order to kind of get the data out as quickly as possible. So what we are hoping is that understanding the decisions that were made in 2023 can help us understand how we got to this moment in time here in the middle of 2025, and then help grant makers make strategic funding decisions moving forward.
Sammy, do the foundations provide you this data? Like, is it an opt-in that they're doing, or are you using like publicly available data? I don't know. Do foundations use Form 990s? Like, I've been in the nonprofit sector, so I know like the Form 990. But where do you all get that data, and are they voluntarily giving it to you, or are you accessing it from public information?
Such a great question, John. It is a mix of both, actually. So our primary data source is from the grant makers themselves. So we work really closely with the Global Philanthropy Project, which is our sister organization that looks at LGBTQ philanthropy on a global scale. They also look at government funding as well, which our report does not. But we work together to create a submission template that is a good old Excel template that asks for specific data about the foundation, as well as each specific grant. And we look for grant descriptions, we look for mission descriptions of the grantee organization, and then specific details about, is this grant for the purpose of re-granting? Is it for a specific LGBTQ population, such as men who have sex with men and queer men, lesbians, queer, bisexual women, and transgender people, et cetera. So we ask for this level of data from the grant makers themselves, from the program officers and the grants managers who know the most about their portfolios. And then we use those data to really do this disaggregates I mentioned earlier. We also supplement the direct submission data with IRS 990 data. So we do look at some IRS data. However, that data is much less complex. There isn't as much detail with regards to grantee organizations' missions or the specific grant description, what the grant is intended for. So we prefer to really use the grant maker submitted data because it's so much richer and it allows us to really do the disaggregates that the field has come to rely on.
Thank you for that clarification. I have a reason for why I asked that specific question when we get to the 2023 report. Before we do, I know I'm setting a lot of like groundwork because I feel like it's kind of important to set the tone or set the map, if you will, so we can better understand where 2023 fits into that. April, because Funders has been doing this for 20 plus years, can you talk to us about the communication of this? Like, what were themes that you've been communicating and the organization's been communicating to the public about what this data and this analysis is showing us about the landscape of grant making for the LGBTQ communities? Like, what overall those like general trends and communication messaging that you've been able to do?
Yeah, for sure. So I worked at Funders for 6 years, and I always remember coming into work and being told, for every $100 awarded by US-based foundations, only 28 cents goes to LGBTQ communities and causes. I've worked here for 6 years, as I mentioned. In the time that I've been here, that number has fluctuated. The highest was 28. The lowest is now 20, which is what we're seeing in the 2023 report, which we'll talk about a little bit more in time. But really putting the numbers in perspective, I think, you hear 200 million, you hear 250 million, which we've gotten into 250 million in the last few years. And now we're down to 209 million. we'll get into that later. But when you hear these numbers without the larger context of what we're seeing on the bigger scale, I think it's easy to be like, well, maybe that's enough, and it's not enough, right? We also like to put the dollars and cents together in that way, specifically for the larger LGBTQ community, and then specifically for trans communities. So for trans communities, that number usually hovers around 4 cents, which is, if we think about the moment that we're in, if we think about the legislative attacks that we're seeing, if we think about every level and every attempt to dismantle and remove trans people from public life, I think, right, we're in a really big uphill battle at this moment. And so having people understand that feels important to me. I, in our organization, work a lot with our members and folks who are coming to us to really think through how they can be better players in LGBTQ philanthropy. And a lot of people come in and they say, well, we're interested in that. You know, like we care about queer people, but we don't do that specifically. And I feel like my job is really to have people understand that no matter what you're funding, you are funding LGBTQ communities, right? I don't walk in every day and decide this is the day that I'm queer versus this is the day that I'm a person of color versus this is the day that I'm X, this is the person there, you know, like I am all these things at once. And so are the grantees of these organizations that we work with, right? And having people understand their role in funding queer liberation, and that it can be really small, feels important. And I think this data set allows us to do that. It takes something that is very, very macro and like puts it in a real world perspective, which makes me really excited about our data every year.
We're going to nerd out because I used to work in LGBTQ health equity for a nonprofit here in Minnesota. And so navigating that conversation you've just had, I've had so many times in Minnesota with health folks around like, you are doing health grant making for the queer community. You're just not thinking of it yet in that perspective. We are talking with April Bethea, Director of External Affairs at the Funders for LGBTQ Issues, along with Sammy Luffy, who is the Director of Research for Funders. I need to fit in a break here. We're going to have more with them when we come back. Check out more progressive news and talk at am950radio.com and heartlandsignal.com. Keep the conversation going on Blue Sky. We're at thegaleyshow.org on Blue Sky. More after the break. You're listening to The Gailey Show. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I'm John Parker. We are coming up already on the bottom of the hour. This is our weekly Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode, where we sit down with a guest or two to take a deep dive into an issue facing the LGBTQ and allied community. Today, my guests are April Bethea, Director of External Affairs at the Funders for LGBTQ Issues, along with Sammy Luffy, who is the Director of Research. We've been talking about this report series that they do, tracking annual spending by grant makers on the LGBTQ community. Before the break, I think we set the stage, right, for this year's report and what we found. All right, then, let's dive into it. There's that first key finding. And as Sammy said, like, it takes a while. So it's 2025, and we're looking at the 2023 report because it takes time for all of the funders to sort of turn in their data. And then imagine it takes some time to analyze it, which I do want to talk about that as well. So this report this summer, you've released it around 2023 data. The first word that I saw in there was less, decrease. And then my heart started to go. So Sammy, maybe we can start with that sort of first finding that you all found in 2023.
Yes, absolutely. So you are right. In this 2023 resource tracking report, there's very little good news. Which is really sobering, especially given what we are witnessing here. Again, in the middle of 2025, we are 6-7 months into the second Trump administration. And what's really important to remember about these findings is that this latest report is from the end of the Biden-Harris administration, right? Arguably the most pro-LGBTQ administration in U.S. history. I'm using air quotes there because though there were policies on paper, whether those policies were implemented and actually led to increased rights for LGBTQ people around the country. That's other research is documenting that. But 2023 was the year of the largest Pride event on the White House lawn. There were so many kind of public displays at that time of solidarity with the queer community. However, though, it's really important to remember that 2023 was also when the Anheuser-Busch and Dylan Mulvaney public controversy was really lit on fire, literally, by conservatives. And when the anti-gender, anti-rights movement really saw the villainization of trans people as a possible tactic to push back on corporations, governments, school systems, et cetera, to really criminalize and villainize the existence of trans people. And one could argue that's how we got, one of the ways that we got to the second Trump administration where we are today. And so the data that we are seeing from calendar year 2023 is really disheartening on top of all of that context. We saw a huge increase in anti-trans bills being introduced across all levels of government from 2022 to 2023 as well. Again, seeing that the opposition were really seeking to use anti-LGBTQ sentiment to get their points across. And so what we found in this report for 2023 is that there was a 19% decrease in funding awarded for LGBTQ communities and causes from 2022 to 2023. The decrease was from 250 million, 258 million in 2022 to 209.4 million in 2023. When adjusted for inflation, that increase goes up to over 22%. And so that's the main finding here, that we are deeply concerned that perhaps philanthropy took its foot off the gas, as it were, and was not funding LGBTQ communities and causes and organizations with as much vigor in 2023 as one would hope, especially given the all-time high we had really been measuring in 2021 and 2022.
Okay, that was going to be my next question there. So, right, between 2 years, 22 and 23, that's a line, not necessarily a trend. So there has been a downward trend, you're saying, from 2020, 2021 over the Biden administration.
Yes, absolutely. And again, perhaps there was a sentiment that perhaps federal funding was filling in some of the gaps because the administration was so supportive of LGBTQ communities and causes, again, on paper. But especially now with the retrenchment of federal funding and the real retreat that we're seeing across the federal government and trickling into state and local governments across the country. In some places, the state and local governments were the trial for now what we're seeing on the global stage, that the decrease in philanthropic support for LGBTQ communities and causes is doubly concerning.
We're talking with April Bethea, Director of External Affairs at the Funders for LGBTQ Issues, along with Sammy Luffy, who is the Director of Research. Anecdotally, we're based in Minneapolis, and we noticed after Minnesota rejected the constitutional amendment here that would have banned gay marriage, and then 9 months later, we actually passed pro-gay marriage legislation extending the rights to all Minnesotans, that funding went down. They were sort of like, yay, you got the marriage, so now we're going to move our money into other areas. Maybe that happened within the Biden administration. As you've been doing this for 20 years, have you seen similar dips, if I may ask, during Democratic administrations? Like after Obergefell in 2015, did you also see sort of a dip happening there because of that Supreme Court decision? Or maybe not attributable specifically to that. I'm just curious if there have been dips like this during a previous Democratic administration, which I guess would be the Obama years. Sammy, April?
Okay. I can't speak specifically to the dips. And I might, Sammy, you can tell me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure that our data has always pretty much charted an upward trend. And maybe that trend has been like $10 million and, not $50 million like we see from 2020 to 2021. Sammy, tell me if I'm incorrect.
No, you're right.
I'm right. Okay, never mind.
You are.
You're gonna own it.
Yeah, you are correct. I love that. And I think there's a sentiment across philanthropy and across LGBTQ movement organizing in general that folks were really organized in moving toward Obergefell and moving towards marriage equality. And then once that was won, then folks really were like, well, then what is our unifying goal that we're working towards? So that is kind of a moment where the movement kind of didn't have a shared organizing strategy point. And so we're kind of seeing the lack of that play out here. Would you agree, April?
Yeah, I would totally agree to that front. I can say that, so again, can't talk to downward trends because there haven't really been downward trends post-marriage, right? But we have seen funder retrenchment in many ways. We've seen a number of LGBTQ funds close. So even some of our closest allies in the field have closed their LGBTQ funds with a sort of level of triumph in the messaging that they have given, right? Like, we've achieved this one thing and we're going to go move on to these other things. And it's like, no, we've achieved this one thing. And also there are so many other struggles that we need to work on, right? And so I think what we're seeing in philanthropy is a number of things. When we think about the dip that we've seen, we can also think about really funder retrenchment and fears of recession. But I know we have to go to a break, so I'm going to stop there.
Oh, thank you for helping me out on that. None of this is possible, this conversation or the Gailey Show, without our advertisers and sponsors. Thank them and tell them you heard about them on The Gailey Show on AM 950 KTNF and WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk. To you from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and airing on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk. Welcome back to the Gailey Show, the only daily LGBTQ radio news and talk show in America. I'm your host, John Parker. It is 33 minutes after the hour. This conversation is racing. I've got to slow down time. It's our weekly Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode, where we sit down with a guest or two for the episode to help us think more clearly on the issues and more queerly on the major issues of the day facing the LGBTQ and allied community. With me today is April Bethea, Director of External Affairs at the Funders for LGBTQ Issues, and Sam Luffy, who is the Director of Research. We're talking about their new report, the 2023 Resource Tracking Report, LGBTQ Grant Making by U.S. Foundations in 2023. We've only gotten to one bullet point, which is that funding went down just over 20% between 2022 and 2023. And I'm also learning that this is the first downward trend that we've seen in the series, in the history of the series, which is over 20 years from a high in the early years of the Biden administration, 2020, 21, 22. So let's continue down the happy road. Who is doing the funding? I think is a good next step here. Who is doing the funding, and like, is there a particular subset of groups where the downward trend has been represented the most? Does that make sense? Is it the larger funders? Is it the smaller funders? Like, where are you seeing that happening?
Yeah, we are really interested in looking at exactly where the decreases took place from 2022 to 2023. Given the political environment that we find ourselves in, this 2023 resource tracking report actually does not include a list of the named top funders in the LGBTQ philanthropic sector. We, in the past, have released the top 20 funders in the space, as well as the top funder by type of funder. So like private foundation, community foundation, et cetera. But because of the political environment and the specific attacks from the federal government toward progressive philanthropy, we decided as an organization, as well as based on feedback from some of the top 20 funders themselves, that they requested anonymity at this time. It brings up a big question about, obviously, who can request anonymity in this moment, who can be anonymous in this moment. And so we really recognize the tenuousness and the risk that many of our frontline foundations, as well as LGBTQ serving organizations, are right now, the risks that they're taking on. So we can't necessarily say that a specific funder is responsible for this decrease. But what is really important to mention is that this 19% decrease we're witnessing is actually due to a decrease in total giving and total grant making by the top 20 foundations. So we looked at the top 20 foundations from 2022 and 2023. We received data from all of those foundations in both years, but we really saw that in 2022, for example, the top 20 foundations awarded $190.8 million. So that was 67% of the total bucket in 2022. Then looking at 2023, the top 20 only awarded 144.9. So that was so much less than the top 20 from the prior year. And so that really shows us, there's a graphic both in our Data Explorer, which is the more like interactive executive summary version of the report. It's available on our website, as well as in the PDF of the report itself that really puts kind of the top heaviness of the funding landscape into very obvious view. So we really see that any decreases by these top 20 grant makers, and some of those decreases are due to leadership changes. They're due to foundations closing their LGBTQ portfolios, as April mentioned earlier. It's sometimes due to just one staff member leaving at the program officer level who was really driving and advocating for this work internally. We see any fluctuation in any of those top 20 foundations as really disruptive to the entire funding portfolio and to the entire funding landscape. So that is the top heaviness trend has continued and has been a trend we've been observing for many years.
And there was also a pretty significant decrease for funding for transgender, nonconforming, and non-binary communities as well. I mean, that went down a stark 11 million, almost $12 million.
Yeah, this decrease was really concerning as well. What we had noticed in 2022 is that funding for transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary communities had really spiked to an all-time high of 48.1 million, 48.2 million. And then that decrease, again, like you said, was down to 36.4. And that decrease was due to a number of different factors. And we're still collecting kind of the story there and trying to dig into what some of the reasons for that decrease were. And some were that so many anti-trans bills were being introduced at the state level in 2023 that many organizations, many grantees were really going to ground and were fighting the battles on their own home turf in order to protect their communities in a more immediate level. There was really strong advocacy by trans leaders, both within philanthropy as well as on the grantee side, to advocate for more philanthropic support for transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary communities in 2022. We have an initiative called the Trans Futures Funding Campaign at our organization, where a lot of that philanthropic organizing was really supported and bolstered by with our leadership. And we saw that increase in new money for trans communities in 2022. That same level of organizing and dedicated push did not happen in 2023. It was a bit of a reorganization year on our side. So that is definitely partially responsible for that decrease. But we're really hearing from our partners that folks were really kind of turning inward and going back to their grassroots level organizing to protect their people at the community level.
We are talking with April Bethea, Director of External Affairs at the Funders for LGBTQ Issues, along with Sammy Luffy, who is the Director of Research. Sammy, you were saying that the funders were asking for anonymity this year, and very clearly the Trump administration has decided that they do have an enemies list, as former Vice President Kamala Harris said. She said that he will have an enemies list, and clearly he's going after universities, he's going after hospitals, he's going after everybody that he doesn't like. As you're prepping for next year's report, my question then is, do you see funders saying, we're not actually going to even give you any data because we don't want any blowback, watching colleagues in other sectors, hospitals, universities, very clearly willing to throw under and publicly humiliate LGBTQ employees, alumni, students, etc.? Are you seeing that yet this year, as you're prepping for next year's report, of funders that just say, now we're not even going to give you our data because we're too afraid of being sued or whatever from this administration?
Absolutely. That is a real concern that we have within our organization, with our board, and with our research partners, because we work really closely with the Global Philanthropy Project, as I mentioned, as well as funders concerned about AIDS, who also puts out a similar resource tracking report every year looking at HIV/AIDS funding from the philanthropic sector. What we are really worried about is exactly what you mentioned, that foundations will not seek opportunity, will not highlight the work that they're doing for LGBTQ communities and causes, will not seek to be named, will not seek to be acknowledged within our movements. And that is deeply, deeply concerning. Again, it comes back to the question of who can remain anonymous, who can afford it, and then whose mission is really stated in their name, right? So we're trying to find additional ways to continue this project in order to hold up the mirror to LGBTQ philanthropy, as it were. So we've committed to collecting data from grants that were awarded in 2024, the same way we collected data for 2023. We will send these data, just like we did for prior years, to the Global Philanthropy Project. That will go into their global iteration of this report. It's called the Global Resources Report. Their report comes out every other year. So their report for 2023 and 2024 will come out next year. So we've committed for the ability to compare data across years to doing this report the same way for 2024 data. But it will really be, a canary in the coal mine for whether or not this project will be able to continue. So we had already decided to take out LGBTQ grantee organization names, once again, to protect the vital work that they're doing. But if we do not get the data that we need from grant makers themselves, then we will really need to reassess our role in the field, as well as the impact that this has on our ability to do our jobs and for philanthropy on the whole. So we're definitely in a moment of kind of wait and see, but we're also preparing for both scenarios, whether it goes smoothly or we receive less data. And we're concerned about whether 990 data will be a valid source of data in the future if grant makers, start concealing the data that they're submitting to the government, right? If the IRS is a trustworthy source for these types of data. So we're definitely looking at all of these variables as we move forward with this project.
The weaponization of the IRS. They've weaponized everything else. I can't imagine that they won't do that as well. April, talk to us about then the next steps in terms of the external affairs component of this, because funders is so great at convening and collective action. And so we have a trend now. We can see it multiple years where the funding is going down. We're clearly in this fraught fascist moment. That's my editorial, but there it is. Talk to me about the external affairs component of this. Now, how do you take this? How do you communicate this out? How are you using this to bolster the case and maybe shift the tide back towards investment in the community?
Yeah, of course. So funders, we know that philanthropy, like any other industry, is people driven, right? There are people who are really working to push for change. And we have seen that in so many ways through our members and other folks. And our role really is to organize those folks. We know that one person can drive grant making in institutions. We've seen it at institutions like Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We've seen it at a number of our peers, right? And so thinking through what information can we provide to folks to really help them make the case? And then also, how are we holding, I don't want to be hokey here. If you knew me, you would know I'm not a hokey person, but how are we holding brief in this moment, right? I think there are a lot of folks who come into philanthropy from other sectors. I come to philanthropy from academia. People come from all sorts of ways of life into this sector, really hoping to, especially movement work, right? Really hoping to push for the communities that they care about. And in this moment where we're seeing funder retrenchment, where we're seeing a lot of bureaucracy pop up, where we don't really know what's going to happen with tax law, we don't know what's going to happen with anything, there is a moment of how much change can I make in this sector that I came into, really knowing that it was fraught in so many ways, but also it's more fraught than I saw before. So I think in this way, right, our role is to really be a convener in that moment. We do this in a number of ways. We have working groups For our member institutions, so we have a private roundtable of some of the top 20 funders. We have a working group that is committed to program officers who are really hoping to troubleshoot this stuff, right? We also have our affinity space called Queer and Trans People in Emergent Space, or QTPIs, which really allows a space for both strategy and just like community building within philanthropy. And we have a number of other programs that are really aimed at pushing the needle, making sure that trans leaders in the sector can thrive and stay in the sector if they choose to, so they can move resources in a way that is sustainable, right? And also thinking through with other folks, like for folks who are not traditionally in philanthropy, but have become resource mobilizers in different ways. So people doing mutual aid, right? These are things that we want to think about. I think as an organization that is membership based, as an organization that is a network of foundations, people come to us at all different levels of LGBTQ funding. We have folks who have never given an LGBTQ grant. We have folks who give nothing but LGBTQ grants, right? And working with those folks and providing a space for them to really think together about, well, this is how I cut through my bureaucracy with my board. How can you do that? The data plays a really important part in this. And also...
Can you all stick around for another break or for another segment?
Yeah.
Okay, good. We're going to take another quick break here. We're going to have more with April and Sammy. I'm going to skip over our Queer in the Cosmos essay because this is too important. We're going to keep going here. One last break. Still lots to get to here with April and Sammy from the Funders for LGBTQ Issues. Welcome back to the Gailey Show. I'm John Parker. We are coming up on the top of the hour. We are still joined by April Bethea, Director of External Affairs at the Funders for LGBTQ Issues, along with Sammy Luffy, who is the Director of Research. Funders for LGBTQ Issues released their report that you can find online, their annual report tracking LGBTQ grant making. It's at lgbtfunders.org. Want to make sure I get that link out there. Before the break, April, you were talking about something really important, and I wanted to keep the conversation going around convening, because that is so important right now, 7 months into this administration, where convening is going to be extra special moving forward. So can we pick up that part of it, of the role that Funders has in terms of convening folks and trying to stabilize, if that's the right word, like your goal for what you want those convenings to do moving into the immediate future?
Yeah, so I think convening is really important to us. So we released in last year, actually, 2024, our new 2024-2027 strategic plan. One of the strategic directions in that is to be a political home for LGBTQ folks in philanthropy, right? Wow. And so that role feels really important to us, both for LGBTQ folks in philanthropy and allies who are really working to push for more resources to our communities in this moment. We know that work is stronger together. When we get people into a room to like cut through bureaucracy, I might not know what a program officer is facing at a family foundation, but somebody at a family foundation would know that, right? So here's how I talked to my board. Here's how I did X, Y, or Z. Feels really important. To that end, we have a conference that just ended and it was wonderful in Houston. But I think a lot of our work right now is really bringing people together to navigate this moment together, and also to really continue to push for the best practices. I think what I will say is it is hard to push for the best practices when those best practices often do not change, right? I've worked here for 6 years. In those 6 years, we always say multi-year grants are the best kind of grant. And we haven't seen a ton of those. We say, general operating support and is more important than project support. And still we're seeing a ton of project support grants, and we need general operating support grants. But I think what this moment calls for, right, is strategy and innovation. We have to think creatively in this moment. And I think right now, as folks are navigating we knew it was going to be bad. I don't think we knew it was going to be quite this bad. And there is grief to that. And there's so much importance of grief, but there's also so much importance in organization. And so whatever we can do to hold space both for grief and for organization feels really important. to really make sure that people are being resourced in a way that is sustainable, and allows for us not just to be defensive, but to really dream for the future that we want.
Yeah, I am here with April Bethea, Director of External Affairs at the Funders for LGBTQ Issues, along with Sammy Luffy, who is the Director of Research. April, you just concluded your conference in Houston, so like ground zero in that particular state. Again, we're only 7 months in to this administration. Can you share some of the themes that were coming up? I imagine what you were just sharing had a lot of it, but were there other, like red flags, like, hey, things that folks were facing in the immediate, like, hey, this is a thing that's happening right now for us that maybe you weren't expecting, or you just heard a lot of people saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were doing a lot of, at our conference, we did a lot of things. And it's also really hard when you're planning a conference in not knowing what the next administration is going to be or what's going to happen, right? So a lot of the sessions that we had picked in before the election, before all of these things, right? And we're still trying to hold a conference that is really relevant in different ways. And so we saw some shifts at the last minute for some of our plenaries. But our sessions were often around immigration, right? They were also around funding trans communities in this moment. What does that look like? We held emergent spaces for folks who were dealing with impacts of the federal funding cuts and freezes that we were seeing, right? So intermediary funds, many of whom are working both domestically and internationally, who received government funding, grappling with what that meant for their work and how to sustain that work. And really just bringing folks together to talk through issues. I think, the issues that we were going to talk about remain the same, but the gravity changed. And so I think what made Funding Forward so important was to have a space for those conversations, and then to take a moment to breathe. So one of the things that we always do at our conference is offer wellness practice and also this really beautiful cabaret show. And so what does it mean to both have really hard conversations and also to make space for joy? And I think that is an internal struggle we are dealing with as a queer organization, and people who are really serious and deeply invested in funding our movement so that they can win. But yeah, it's a struggle,
It's bringing me back to the start of our conversation where we're talking to folks about you are funding these things without realizing it. And sometimes I felt like when I was in the nonprofit space and working for LGBTQ health equity, that it was sort of like, well, you're the gays over there, and then there's immigration over here, and then there's the environment over here. And, when I look at the case of, Andrea Hernandez Romero, who was disappeared to El Salvador, this gay man who's fleeing political violence and also for being queer from a particular country. And so now when you see like all of these TPAs, temporary protected status, TPS, and now there's folks across the Midwest that are like, you're gone. You have to pack up and leave because your TPS has been revoked. How many queer folks are in there that now are like, I can't go back to my country? There's the political violence. And so I'll be very curious to see how, on the one hand, yes, there's going to be support needed in the immigration space, but, is it going to be erasing queer folks while they're doing that? And that is a huge issue to bring up right at the end of our time. But I want to thank April and Sammy for joining me here today. The website is lgbtfunders.org. You can not only read this report, you can read all of the amazing research that they are doing, that Sammy is leading for them, for the funders. Again, April and Sammy, thank you so much. And I'm just going to have you back because there's so many other things that we're going to have to talk about.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John.
And thank you for listening today. Up next on WCPT 820, it's Choose Views with Richard Chu on AM 950. It is the Matt McNeil Show, and stay tuned after that for Native Roots Radio. Then at 10 p.m. Central, step into the unknown with Greg Bakken on Ghost Box Radio. We will see you back here, same time, same place. Until then, keep it queer, America.